Welcome to Ask John. John, there's a question from another student at Arcadia High School in California, and it's interesting. The question is, how did the American Revolution encourage the idea of voting, if in fact it did?
Well, the American Revolution did a number of things from a broad perspective that encouraged the idea of voting. First of all, from a constitutional perspective, it pretty much endorsed the concept of written constitutions. Most of the colonies had charters that served as a foundation for their governments. They, however, passed various legislation over the century and a half that they were in existence, and through experience, they came up with their forms of government, very much like the English had done, without a specific written constitution. But the Americans, they liked this idea of a written constitution that would limit government. There was a sense that the Americans, taking the old Whig philosophy that was so widely developed in the 17th century in England, that the king was a dangerous element, and that more power ought to be given to Parliament, particularly to the House of Commons. And so you have the English Civil War and the restoration of the monarchy. Then after the Commonwealth period didn't work out very well, and then the Glorious Revolution of 1688. All of those things contributed to the English form of government, but and that philosophy of conflict between Parliament and the king was transferred over to America, and they felt that the best way to limit government in relationship to the people would be a written constitution. So you have that, and within those written constitutions, and in fact I should say that in May of 1776, about 2 months before the Declaration of Independence, Congress on the 10th of May and the 15th of May, they pass a resolution, and then the preamble to that resolution, both written by John Adams, calling for the people, the American people, in their colonies to write new constitutions, get rid of their charters, write new constitutions that are amenable to the people, that would give them the authority. Sovereignty would lie with the people, and that would be specified in their state constitutions. And all of the 13 states do that. Connecticut and Rhode Island do it in the form of revising their charters. So they don't have a completely new constitution as the other states do, but their charters, they sort of do on their computers of their day, they do a global search and replace. They get rid of king in council and they replace it with people, so that the people will be the sovereign entities within their new states. And within those written constitutions, you have certain protections and certain rights that are specified, including the right to vote, and other rights that are listed that will encourage voting. One would be rotation in office. Another would be separation of powers, so that you have different elements of society being represented, whether it be the wealthy or in one house, or the less wealthy in another, or whether it be whatever certain geographic areas might be represented in one place or another. But there would be other provisions. For instance, 5 of the state constitutions provided that ministers, religious ministers, should not be eligible to serve in state legislatures. This was an argument that these people had other duties and they had too much control over the minds of people to be serving in that legislative capacity. And so there are a number of other provisions in state constitutions that related to voting rights. And as time goes along, you see that the qualifications for voting get less and less. And eventually, by the 1820s, there's no longer any voting minimum requirement that's necessary for voting. Another factor during the American Revolution was the institution of a Republican form of government, which means the definition of a Republican form of government is that people do the electing, at least for some of the offices, and they directly elect them, and other offices, these office holders are appointed indirectly by various segments of the government, but eventually their election is based upon the election of the people. And so this concept of a Republican form of government is an important contributory factor to this idea of voting. Now, specifically, you have other actions that take place. For instance, the wholesale elimination of a class of people, loyalists, who are usually much more, much wealthier as a whole, and they are, for the most part, what could be considered placement, that they were appointed by government officials, whether it be the imperial government in London or by their advocates in America, the colonial governors, royal governors. By eliminating this class of people, placement as loyalists, you get rid of that class. But a corollary to that is that these people were viewed as dangerous elements, and their lands, their properties, and not just the land, but also their holdings, their furniture, etc., was confiscated from them. And in addition to the confiscation, you had the sale of this confiscated property. And what this did was to break up some of the huge manors and plantations and property holdings of this very wealthy group, and this property was then parceled out among ordinary folks, and so it was furthering the concept of republicanism. And these folks then were given property. They sometimes bought it at a very reasonable price, but this land would not have been available to them had that confiscatory policy not been followed. And in fact, there's a recent book that was out saying that's the single most important action of the American Revolution in New York was the confiscatory policy that took away these lands from the Loyalists. So that allowed many more people to vote, and the people who would be elected were from a much broader segment of society as well. For the most part, there was a sense of voting was required in this Republican form of government. That is, republics can only survive if the people are virtuous. And one part of that virtuosity would have been to have people vote and be aware of the issues. And one way that was done was through newspapers. And the newspapers really flourished during the Revolution. There were only a handful of newspapers before the Revolution. After the Revolution, there were 75, eventually by 1788, 90 newspapers in the country. And this afforded a mechanism for a broad civil discourse to take place that wasn't available really before the Revolution. So that civil politic became much more readily available, and people felt that they should be involved in this voting process, and so they voted more regularly than they ever did before the American Revolution.
Perhaps I could follow up with this idea of expanding the right to vote during ratification. Could you speak to that issue of how, when people elected their delegates to their convention, that there was an expansion of the right to vote?
Okay, before I do that, let me add one more thing that I didn't mention before, that women were not allowed to vote, slaves were not allowed to vote, and there was a certain residence requirement, usually not very long residence, that would allow you to vote. In New Jersey, there was an exception that women were allowed to vote if they met the property qualification. That was not done, in my estimation, through a considered overt act. What they did in New Jersey in their constitution was they did not use the word freemen. They used the word inhabitant. And so any inhabitant could vote if they met the property qualification. Well, there were some women that said, we're inhabitants and we have the property qualification. We should be allowed to vote. And they were allowed to vote in New Jersey. When the state constitution was revised a couple decades later, they corrected that error that was there and they put freemen in, and women were not allowed to vote after that. And so the vote is not expanded to women in the American Revolution, although I must say that a lot of women were actively involved in politics and in economics, much more so than the laws might indicate. As far as African Americans, obviously slaves could not vote, but freedmen in some states had the right to vote. In other states, they were prohibited from voting. And so that's that you have to look at each individual state. In South Carolina, I can tell you that freedmen could not vote, and they had relatively few rights, even though they were not slaves. In New York, that's not the case. In New York, freedmen can indeed vote, and they did indeed vote there, and so that's on an individual state basis. So now, looking at this other question, Tim,
ratification,
about ratification. All the states were asked by the Federal Convention and then by Congress to call state conventions, and all the states eventually do. Rhode Island takes a long time to call a state convention, but it also does call a state convention. And among the resolutions provided for in calling the state conventions was a provision for the election of delegates to those conventions. And for the most part, there is a liberalization of who might vote and who might be elected to those conventions. And so for those that could be elected, you no longer had to always be a resident of the county that you represented or the town that you represented. Sometimes you could represent a county or a town in which you own property. Sometimes that was not even necessary. And so, for instance, in Virginia, when it was felt that James Madison could not be elected from his county, Federalists felt, let's find another way to get him elected. And that was certainly true of George Mason. There was no way in the world that he could be elected to the Virginia Ratifying Convention from Fairfax County, his home county, because it was so dominantly controlled by Federalists. So he was elected from Stafford County, where he had property, which was a much more anti-Federalist oriented county. And so there is a liberalization as to who might serve as a delegate. There's also a liberalization as to who might vote. Some of the let me say further that some of the states, by having conventions, it expanded the delegates who could come, because as was obvious in 5 state constitutions, ministers could not serve in the legislatures. They could serve in the state conventions. Governors could not serve in the legislatures. Delegates to Congress could not serve in the state legislatures. All these positions were available for individuals who held those positions to serve in the state ratifying conventions. So it was open to a much broader segment of society. As far as those voting, the suffrage of those voting for delegates to the conventions, again, there was a liberalization. The property requirement was often reduced, and in some cases totally eliminated. And we see that specifically in the case of New York, because when New York delegates were elected for their convention, at that same election, there was a vote for assemblyman and a vote for the senator from that particular district, which included several counties. But the assemblymen were from that county, as were the delegates to the convention from that specific county. And we see that there were probably 40 to 60% more voters casting votes for delegates for the convention delegates than casting votes for assemblymen. And this we judge to be a product of the fact that there was no property requirement for voting for delegates to the convention, the state convention. This could be an incorrect surmise, but I don't think it is. I think it's a correct surmise. That it wasn't just because it was such an important issue, it was because people who wanted to vote could vote for delegates to the convention when they were not able to vote because they didn't meet the property qualification to vote for assemblymen, senators, and governors, and the governor in New York. So there was a liberalization of both suffrage for electing delegates and for those who might serve in the state conventions.
Thank you, John.